joining us on another episode of Tea and Trowels, the series from the Florida Public Archaeology Network, where we chat with archaeologists about their work and what archaeology means to them. I'm one of your hosts, Emily Jane Murray, and today I'm excited to be joined by Mike Thomin, the manager of the Destination Archaeology Resource Center at FPAN's Coordinating Center. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the show, so I'm glad to be on it.
Hey, it's a big get to get the host of Hike with Mike, right?
Right. Yeah. So many views on that. Yeah.
Well, would you like to say anything else about yourself, and then introduce your mug, most importantly?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, that was a great introduction. But yes, my name is Mike Thomin. I work at the Florida Public Archaeology Network at the headquarters, which is based in Pensacola. So, of course, we have offices throughout the whole state, including in the wonderful city of St. Augustine, which, you know, is the oldest city. It's the oldest continuous city. But I do multiple things here. So I manage our Destination Archaeology Resource Center, which is our museum that we have at our coordinating center. It's unfortunately been closed since COVID-19 started, but we're excited because we're looking at potentially opening up a few days a week to the public in May. So just in a couple of weeks from the time that this was recorded anyways. And then my mug that I chose, I had a kind of hard time picking one because I have a few that I really, really like. And I thought it might make sense to have one with a pirate ship on it. But I went with this one instead. This mug was actually made by my sister-in-law. She's a potter. She's Mercedes Rogers is her name. You can follow her on Full Circle Gallery, Full Circle on Instagram. But what's really cool about this mug is if you look closely, you can see the wave patterns, and those are actually based on pottery designs that were commonly found on like Fort Walton cultural time period, indigenous native people ceramics here in Northwest Florida. And even the form of this particular mug is based on an artifact that was found not far from the Fort Walton Temple Mound, that dating back to that, you know, Mississippian kind of time period. So it's based on an actual artifact and some of those designs that we see on some indigenous pottery in the Southeast. So she's got a lot of other ones out there too. She makes functional pottery. So you can actually, I microwave this a lot. So yeah, it's a fun little mug. So cheers, drinking out of it today.
Cheers. I am jealous and I will be looking this up. I'm a geek for like reproductions or drawing inspiration, you know, from archaeology and things like that. Well, I did my best to find a good pirate mug in your honor. So
it looks great. It's very piratey.
Yes.
It looks like if I didn't know better, I would say that you would probably be a pirate. And there were female pirates. So
there were.
You pass.
Yes. Excellent. Well, how did you get into archaeology?
Yeah. So I love, one thing I love about this particular series is that you ask that question, and, you know, I've probably haven't seen every single interview that you've done, because I think you've done close to 50 now. So that's a lot of people to talk to. But one of the things I love about this question is the answers that people get. And one thing I've noticed is that a lot of the archaeologists you've had on, you know, their interest in the field of archaeology or history, it always dates back to like an early childhood memory. You know, that's, you know, you very rarely, I think, you find people go, oh, well, you know, I turned 65 and all of a sudden I'm interested in archaeology. No, it's usually always dates back to early childhood. And I'm no different in that regard. So I think there's a lot of influences in my life from being a young kid, from my grandparents taking us around to different places. When I lived out in Colorado, I went to Mesa Verde when I was a pretty young kid. And I thought it was just an incredible sight. And the idea that that was still there after all that time was just something that was fascinating to me. And I think it was kind of nurtured over the years. You know, my mom, she was really into like family history, and my grandfather was really into genealogy. So I just kind of grew up around stories, family stories and documents, and it just was always fascinated with it. Of course, there's like I was, you know, a child of the 80s and 90s. So there was Indiana Jones. So there was that kind of popular cultural media that certainly influenced that interest. But then when I was about 11 or 12, my dad was military, so we moved around quite a bit. And I lived for 3 years in Okinawa, which is a small island off the coast of Japan. And we lived off base for about a year and a half. And one of the first days of school that I had started, I went to a DoD school, Department of Defense. And one of the first days, these guys came in, EOD guys, which these are like the bomb disposal people. And they had a big table. And on this table, they laid out all these like munitions from World War II, like grenades and bombs and all this stuff. And they were like, if you're ever out in the boonies, which is what they called like the jungle essentially, and they're like, do not, and you see these, do not touch them. Like, come, because Okinawa was bombed during the Pacific Theater, like pretty heavily. There was some really terrible fighting that took place on that island during World War II, and so that I think too was something that just interested me, kind of built on that interest. And then when I was about 12, we had moved here to Florida, and my mom started volunteering with the University of West Florida out at a site that they had found on Pensacola NAS, which was a Presidio, a Spanish Presidio dating to the late 1600s. And she volunteered with, they have a very robust public archaeology program at UW. They still do today, but it dates back to at least the early 90s, late 80s. And I remember her telling me stories about stuff they had found throughout the day. And I thought, well, I'd always seen archaeology as something that I think, like a lot of people, where you think, oh yeah, that's something that you'll find out in the jungles of, Costa Rica, Guatemala, or out in Egypt, but you never think of it really locally. And that was really the first time that I thought, wow, there's like significant stuff here locally. And of course, growing up in this area through my teenage years, listening to the radio, we've had a long ongoing program called at the time it was called Unearthing Pensacola by Dr. Judy Bentz. And so I grew up listening to that too. So I guess the long answer is, it started early, but it was kind of, allowed to germinate and was nourished over the years growing up. So I couldn't imagine doing anything else related to that field anyways.
That's really fun. I didn't know you and Dr. B went back so far.
Yeah. So I know. I would have never thought when I was like, 11, 12 years old, listening to this radio program in my mom's car, that one day I'd actually have to write for that show. So that's one of the first projects I was put on when I started with FPAN a long time ago now. It's over 10 years ago. I first started working for FPAN. That was one of the projects I got to work on, was write scripts for what's now called Unearthing Florida. So yeah, it's weird. It's kind of surreal. I remember when my boss, Bill, Dr. William Lees, or who we call Bill, when he told me that that's the thing I'd be working on, I was like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. All right, I better tell my mom. Like, hey mom, remember that show?
Small world.
Yeah.
Well, can you tell us about some of your research in 30 seconds?
Yeah. So my training has really been primarily, I was trained as a historian, but I've done public archaeology and public history professionally for the last 15 years. But a lot of my interest is more around maritime. I do dive. I've been on shipwrecks. I haven't really done actually any field work on shipwrecks, although I've been around work being done on shipwrecks. But my interest has always been maritime. And then several years ago, probably like over 10 years ago, I started getting into researching piracy, and then specifically piracy in the early 1800s, which a lot of people don't realize. They think piracy ended with the Golden Age, 1720s. They don't realize that 100 years later, it was just as bad in the Gulf and the Caribbean. And so I started kind of doing some local stuff, and then it just sort of grew from there. And so most recently, I've published a few articles about piracy and privateering during that period, during the Age of Revolutions, which is like 1775 to like 1825, depending on, which time frame you want to go with. But more recently, we just submitted a manuscript for a colleague of mine. We co-wrote a manuscript for the next Archaeology of Piracy book, which is going to be the third volume in that series. So I haven't gotten the comments back yet. So we'll see. Hopefully it's not too bad and it'll be easy to fix if there's any issues. But yeah, that's basically what I've been interested in terms of like academic stuff.
I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful chapter, and it'll be exciting to get all this Florida piracy stuff. People love pirates, so it's such a great public archaeology, public history topic. Like, you can just reel people in when you mention pirates.
Yeah, they just love it. And I love the series that you guys that you had the intern put together. It was awesome. So for people that don't know, if you go to the Northeast YouTube channel. They've got a great few-part series about pirates in St. Augustine. So that happened. It was real. So it's really cool. Not for the people being victimized, but for us being so distant. So.
Yes. So what's your favorite tool in your toolkit?
Oh, my favorite tool. Yes. So I should have pulled it out, but it's right behind me. So for me, again, my main professional experience is with public archaeology. And because of that, especially over the last year with COVID, how we've had to really pivot towards, just doing digital stuff. My favorite tool definitely, and really the thing that I've used the most over the last year is this camera. For in public archaeology, of course, it's all about involving the public in the archaeological process. And one of the things that we've really all had to do, I think, and not just FPAN, but just anybody doing public archaeology, is learn how to shoot and edit videos. And so this is our Sony Alpha 6000. It's a great camera that I've been carrying around quite a bit, doing the Hike with Mike and other online programs that we put out there. But I love this tool. I love being able to tell stories. The thing I love about public archaeology and talking to people about our past, about our culture and history and heritage, and how things have changed and how some things haven't really changed over the years, is being able to tell those stories through the finds that archaeologists have been able to do over the, certainly over the past several decades. And so I would say definitely this camera, although I'm finding more and more frequently that it's been my iPhone. I think they've gotten to the point now where the video quality is just as good as a mirrorless camera. But I think it's really important that archaeologists are out there informing the public about what they do and the importance of their work, and documenting it and putting it on different platforms, whether it's TikTok or, Instagram Reels or YouTube. I think it's a really important thing that archaeologists are doing, and I hope they'll continue to do it. I remember probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I gave a paper at, I think it was either Society of American Archaeology, or maybe it was Society of Historical Archaeology, but I gave a paper that discussed like multimedia storytelling in public archaeology, and looking at these different platforms like YouTube specifically. And at the time, there weren't really a lot of archaeologists on YouTube that had huge followings. There was a few, and there were certainly some museums that had pretty good followings and were doing great, making really great content, but it was really just a handful. And so, I was hoping that we would, over the next few years, see an increase of that platform being used. And boy, has that certainly changed. I think, now when you go on YouTube, you'll find lots of archaeologists on there that are really creating fantastic content. And so it's been really nice to see that. And but the reason why I think it's so important is because while you'll certainly find some really great ethical messaging in some of the content you'll find on these digital platforms, you'll also find a lot of metal detecting and looting and unethical things happening too. So I think it's really important for us to get that message out, because the other side's certainly getting their point of view across. So it's really important that we put our content out there too, so people know that there's some of the problems with just going out and metal detecting on federal property or state lands that are protected. And so I think it's really encouraging, and I'm glad to see shows like this continue, because I know as things start to open up, we all have lots of other things we got to do. So I'm really glad to see some of these programs that continue going forward.
It's been interesting to see the wider audiences that we can reach from far slung, but then it also becomes oh, but are we still, so much is lost and not seeing people face to face. So
yeah, totally. I agree. I mean, I definitely don't prefer to be in front of this thing. Let me tell you, I feel comfortable being behind it, but COVID has kind of forced me to come on the other side of it. And it is hard. It is very difficult to be natural in front of a camera. So I have so much respect for people who can do that and do it well. I mean, it is really a skill, but just like any other tool that public archaeologists use, I see it just as another tool. It's a tool in the toolbox that we got to use. And we can use the same basic principles of like interpretation to create content, just in a different format. And then one other thing that I just kind of wanted to briefly mention about the importance of using platforms like this for public archaeologists or any archaeologist or historian or whatever, anybody related to the field. And that is, for a long time, I think we've been had to be really reactive to some of these like cable television shows that come out and like promote looting. And so it's like we wait for these shows to come out and then we'd write a letter like as an organization, and then like maybe they change it, maybe they don't, or maybe they just get canceled and go away. Well, what's great about platforms like YouTube is we can cut that middle production site out of it completely, because really, I mean, I know archaeologists have, and I don't want to say that there's not any good shows out there. There definitely are. Nova Science Now and Secrets of the Dead. They've been Time Team. They've been doing great stuff for years. Even Drain the Oceans. They do really good stuff too when they work with archaeologists. But I mean, ultimately, even if you're involved in a TV production as an archaeologist, if you're being interviewed, it doesn't matter really it matters what you say, but in the end, the message that is put out there on the final episode is not up to the person behind the camera. It's not up to the person in front of the camera. It's up to the person that's sitting at the computer in post-production and how they choose to edit it. And so this, I think, gives us so much more control of what kind of messaging that we put out, compared to, working with cable television shows, which I think we should 100% do. And like I said, there's some good ones out there, but I think this is another way that we can reach a lot of people and explain, why archaeology is important and why it should be protected.
Well, it's funny because I feel like those shows always try to add a extra, like they always have to make things more intense or more exciting. And I'm going to segue into our next question. As we've heard from the answers to this question about what your best worst field story is, archaeology has lots of exciting moments. So
yeah, they totally.
So what's your best worst field story that you can now laugh about?
Sure. Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, I don't have a real ton of field work experience. I've done like a couple of shovel tests, and mainly most of what I've done has been like monitoring. So, but I do have a good one that happened not too long ago. During when 2020 COVID happened and everything shut down, I got two small kids, and my son was in he's in third grade now, so he was in second grade, and all of a sudden he was just at home with me. So I did virtual school with him, but every once in a while I'd have to go out and like shoot a video or go monitoring, do some of the site monitoring for a grant that we've gotten over the last year that has been all about monitoring archaeological sites that are threatened by sea level rise, erosion, more powerful storm surge, climate change related stuff. And so every once in a while I would take them out to monitor some of these sites. And I always took him to places that had been to before. So there was never like an issue of him being in danger. And all we were doing was basically taking photos and taking notes and stuff. So nothing real dangerous. But I took him out one day to monitor one of these sites. And I'd been to this site probably half a dozen times before. It was in a state park. There was a nice, easy trail to it. It was probably about maybe half a mile of the trail. And it was a big, wide trail too. The trail is called the Wiregrass Trail. And the site that I was taking him to was a cattle dipping vat. And so yeah, so a cattle dipping vat were constructed beginning in the early 20th century all across the state of Florida. And basically what they were these, like, the ones I've seen are basically made out of concrete, and they were like subterranean like vats that would go in the ground. And basically what they were doing was they were trying to kill cattle tick disease, and because there was a big cattle industry in Florida. And so basically these cattle were getting these ticks would bite them and infect them with this really terrible disease, and it became a big problem. So they wanted to kill the ticks. So they built all these cattle dipping vats, and they filled them up with really nasty chemicals like arsenic and all sorts of really nasty things. And the cattle would literally just, go down in one side, dip in it, and come out the other. And they just race them all through that to kill the ticks. And it actually worked. they exterminated this particular, I believe they did exterminate this particular disease. But the problem is it left all these like really polluted areas with these cows, and there's like thousands of them that are still across the state. So anyway, so that was the site that we had to go to. And when we were walking there, it had rained really hard the night before. And I'd been out there when it rained before, but not when it rained this hard. And so we got to this one point in the trail. We were really close. We were probably like maybe 100 meters from the site. I mean, I could see it from where I was standing. And so we got to a point in the trail where there's it was just totally covered in water, probably like a couple feet deep. And there was no way around it. The only way was to go through it. And so I didn't want to turn around because it was like half a mile back to the car and we were so close. So I told my son, like, okay, let's go across. And so we went across and we made it and everything was fine. And then I took the photos. And then on the way back, he really did not like having to walk through that water. And I don't blame him because I kind of didn't want to either. But so I was like, well, let me put you up on my shoulders and I'll walk you across. And so he gets up on my shoulders and I start walking. And the first step was fine. And the second step, I pulled my foot out and I couldn't pull it out. I was stuck in it, just like suction. And then I just fell right over. And so I went in the water and he's still on my shoulders. He's like holding onto my head, like pulling my hair back. And luckily I was able to, I don't know how, but I was able to stand up and like walk him out. So he didn't get wet at all, but I got soaked. And then it was like we had to then walk that half a mile or whatever it was back to the car and then drive like an hour home. So it was pretty miserable. So I never brought him again. I never brought him out again to the site. So that was my worst probably moment. And then for my best moment, it would be more, I think, with public archaeology. So several years ago, I worked on a project called By These Hands. And basically it was looking at some African-American cemeteries in Pensacola, specifically at like vernacular headstones. So these were like locally sourced and made headstones. And there was a church that owns, John the Baptist Church, owns a couple of these cemeteries, and they had written a grant with the Florida Humanities Council to do some more research to see if they could find out more information about, like, who built these vernacular headstones and who are the people that were buried at some of these locations. And so I was assigned a couple of the different headstones at one of the smaller ones, cemeteries called John the Baptist or Montgomery Cemetery, which is in a little neighborhood in downtown Pensacola in the East Hill area. And anyways, so I went out to the site to, write down any information I could get up from the headstones. And one of them in particular ended up being, well, I guess I'll focus on the other one, but one of them was great because I was actually able to find one of the descendants of this particular lady who was buried there. And he had been trying to do genealogy for years and kind of got stuck with not knowing who she was. And because she had put the names of the sons on the headstone, it was pretty easy for me to connect her with this particular individual. So he eventually came down to the cemetery. So it was kind of cool to connect a descendant with an ancestor who he didn't really know about. But in one case, in terms of like field work, the other headstone I got was a guy named Ebby Greer. And I had gone to the site and I basically figured out who he was from census records and going into the archives, looking at city directories, things like that. So I kind of knew essentially who he was. But when I was writing up the final report, I had forgotten to take a photo, like a good photograph of the headstone. So I was like, well, let me go, it's close by. Let me go back out there. So I go back out there and take some photos of the headstone. And every time I had been at the cemetery, there was a house right next to it. And there was like 5 or 6 gentlemen who would always be out in the front yard, just like hanging out, just chatting. And so I took my photos and I was like, I wonder if anyone's talked to these guys, So I walk over and I introduce myself. I said, hey, has anybody told you like what we're doing here? Because I know they've probably seen our cars and stuff. And they're like, no. So I told them basically about the project. And I said, hey, you wouldn't happen to know who, like this guy, Ebby Greer, would you? And they're like, no. And I was like, oh, okay. So I was about to get back in the car and then I heard this lady's voice. I turned around as this lady and she was like, she's just walking by. She's like, hey, I saw you talking to those guys. What are you doing out here? And I told her what I was doing. And she goes, oh, yeah, his grandson lives right down the street. Ebby Greer's grandson lives right down the street. And I was like, oh, wow. And she's like, do you want to meet him? And I was like, all right, let's go. So I start following her, and it wasn't just down the street. It was like just like several blocks we're walking, and I'm thinking like, what am I doing? So she takes me to this house, and she tells me like, wait, there's no sidewalk. So it was like just in the middle of the street. She's like, wait right here. And she goes up to the door and she knocks on the door. And this guy answers the door, and she like points at me, and they're talking. And then a few minutes later, she like kind of waves me up, like, come on up. So I walk up there, and I tell the guy, like, introduce myself, and hey, I think I have some information. She tells me that this is your, grandfather. I had some census records and stuff with me. So I was like, I don't know if you've ever seen this stuff before, but if you want to, I'd be happy to share it with you. So he's like, come on in. So I go in his house, and we sit down, and I show him the documents, and the information I got from that hour-long talking, Raymond Greer is his name. I would have never gotten from doing research. It just would never have happened. I found out in that hour that that this particular individual ran what was called the H&O Cafe, which was and unfortunately closed down a couple years ago, but it was an African-American owned cafe that opened in the 1940s, and it became like the meeting spot for civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s. So like this is like the guy that started it, and this is like I'm talking to his grandson, and then before I left, I asked him, he had mentioned like, oh, his uncle worked in the concrete business. And I was like, huh, these vernacular headstones are all like poured concrete. And we've been trying to figure out like who poured these stones. And so I asked him, and he said, if it was in the 40s and 50s, if any concrete was poured in this area, it was his uncle. So it's like this amazing opportunity by just having a conversation with the community was so profound in terms of like what I was able to find out about this particular individual's life and who possibly created this vernacular headstone. And it was only possible because of the community that was there. And it was only possible because, they were nice enough to like talk to me. So I think that's such an important point, including communities in any archaeological work that's done is so important, not just for like the value of the site and for the community itself, because that's who we should be doing it for, but also in terms of like research questions that you have or that the community has. You will not get the same amount of information if you don't include the people who live in those neighborhoods or wherever you're working at. So that was really eye-opening for me. And since then I'm so grateful that he let me in the house and talked to me for an hour. But that was definitely I think that was my best moment doing like field stuff.
It's a great example of, I think Western culture, our culture puts so much emphasis on like written documents and recorded history. And like, that's just a great example of like how much isn't written down. And I think, that as archaeologists too, like that's the thing, you can find that's not been written down. You can find the information. But yeah, oral histories can be like super important here. So.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I mean, and being trained as a historian, like that's kind of what's beaten into you is the primary source, the original document. That's the most important thing. But I was also trained in public history, and so you do oral history for that. So luckily I had that background, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's just as much value in the oral traditions as there are in anything written down.
Well, I think this will probably keep us in a similar vein of conversation. But I'll ask our big question here. How do you think archaeology can help save the world?
Yeah, it's such a big question to answer. I think certainly there's like value, like there's a lot of value in archaeology to society, whether it's, like on an educational level, like in schools, whether it's like heritage tourism with economy, whether it's just, learning about past mistakes and how we can kind of move forward. So I don't know if it's like as a field, if it's like saves the world, but I think certainly it can make the world a better place. And I think it can do that by, again, kind of going back to that example of, talking to the community who lived around that cemetery. making those connections with people on an individual level to help them learn about their own heritage or history, or vice versa. I think we can learn so much about not only like trying to pass right wrongs in a way, but just going through sort of this uh, process of discovery together, I think can make people more relatable to each other. And I think, especially during a period that we live in right now, that's probably more important than anything is, we do have differences, especially in this country. Like, we have a lot of differences just within our own cities and communities in terms of, like, whether it's, gender or race or socioeconomic situation. And those should be talked about, and then celebrated too. I mean, differences are not a bad thing. But I think it also enables us to really see that we have a lot in common. And I think anthropology and archaeology have kind of a storied past. I mean, it's definitely not always been like a positive thing. It's been used for really terrible things in the past. But I think kind of looking forward, and kind of where the field is headed with, looking more at community archaeology or anti-racism, I think it has a lot of potential to make every community just a little bit better. And if that eventually turns into saving the world, then great. But it's only going to happen if we make sure that we're involving the public and communities. It doesn't happen in the ivory tower. It's going to happen, out in the field, and listening and responding in ways that are beneficial to everybody.
I like that. We've talked to a lot of folks about, the information we get, or kind of the outcomes we have, or kind of the end results, but that the process can be just as healing and just as important, and really be just as valuable as whatever you're getting out of it at the end of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at like our office in Tampa, what they've been doing with some of the African American cemeteries out there. It's just like incredible. It's incredible work, and it's so meaningful, I think, to those communities specifically. So, yeah, kudos to them and everybody else. And I know I'm using just a few examples, but I know there's a lot of work being done towards that end, and it's it's different than it was, certainly, I think, 15, 20 years ago, but that's not a bad thing. It's good to evolve, and it's how archaeology stays relevant in today's world, for sure.
I agree. Well, we have our bonus question for you. What's been keeping you sane? We'll say lately.
Lately, yeah, I mean, it's crazy times that we live in, for sure, but definitely I think just spending time with family. Like I said, I have 2 kids, so we've gone on a couple. We like to go out to like mountains and cabins, so that's been really nice to kind of just slow down and get away from technology. And definitely like just trying to doing my even not just a hike with Mike stuff, but just like going out in the woods and having some peace and being away from technology has really been refreshing. It's been nice to kind of walk in the woods and not have to deal with the chaos of the internet sometimes. So I wish I could say the other thing that, yeah, I usually do that kind of helps de-stress a lot is diving, because for me, when I go diving and my head gets under the water, I'm only thinking about like, breathing and like efficient movements and like what is around me in that moment, and all the other problems that I have, or that my worries or concerns, I'm not thinking about in those moments. But unfortunately, I just haven't had an opportunity to do that. But I think now a lot of the dive places are starting to open back up. So maybe that will be my next thing to de-stress. Will go on a dive, which would be nice.
Yeah, diving definitely is like literally going to another world in a lot of
It
ways.
is, yeah. It's terrifying sometimes, but like you got to be aware. Like you can't be thinking about other stuff. You got to be like in the moment, and that's I think everybody needs that every now and then. Is just kind of be in the moment and not worry about tomorrow or next week or next year. Just live in that particular moment in time.
Moving meditation, if you will.
Yeah. Maybe that's what I should do. Meditate. Yeah, that might be a thing, right? Underwater meditation. Maybe it is. I bet you it is a thing.
Well, I mean, meditating can just be focusing on something.
Yeah.
The idea is just to calm and still your mind. So I can see where diving is meditating.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about it like that, but you're right. It is. There's a lot of similarities,
Yeah.
at least for me. Maybe not for everybody. I'm
Yeah.
sure some people are just terrified when they go on. Like, this is terrifying. Yeah, it happens.
That's the dumbest thing for me.
Yeah, my wife is. I've tried to get her to learn how to dive, and she has no interest. She's terrified of it, which I get. I'm scared of heights, so like I'm staying away from cliffs. So
Yeah.
no cliff diving.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks for everyone who's joining us at home. Cheers.
Cheers.